Hello, and thank you guys for coming. We are reading a passage from Dr. Davis's latest book, which is a compilation of essays called Freedom is a Constant Struggle. I think that movements, feminist movements, other movements, are most powerful when they begin to affect the vision and perspective of those who do not necessarily associate themselves with those movements. So that the radical feminisms or radical anti-racist feminisms are important in a sense that they have affected the way especially young people think about social justice struggles today. That we cannot assume that it is possible to be victorious in any anti-racist movement as long as we do not consider how gender figures in, how gender and sexuality and class and nationality figure into those struggles. It used to be the case that the struggles for freedom were seen to be male struggles. Freedom for black people was equivalent to freedom for the black man, and if one looks at Malcolm X and many other great figures, you see this constantly. But now this is no longer possible. And I think that feminism is not an approach that is or should be embraced simply by just women, but increasingly it has been an approach embraced by people of all genders.
Well, I think the interconnectedness of anti-racist movements with gender is crucial. But we also need to do this with class, nationality, and ethnicity. I don't think we can imagine black movements in the same way today as we once did. The assumption that black freedom was freedom for the black man created a certain kind of border around the black struggle, which can no longer exist. So I think that the black radical tradition has to embrace the struggles against anti-Muslim racism, which is perhaps the most virulent form of racism today. It makes no sense to imagine eradicating anti-black racism without also eradicating anti-Muslim racism. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Angelique Harris, who also happens to be my mentor.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening and welcome. I'm very excited to be able to introduce Dr. Davis to you all. The campus community, Milwaukee community, and my mother. There are a number of reasons why we were so eager to have a scholar as impactful as Dr. Davis visit our campus and our city, and why now is so important. We are in very contentious times which will prove to be very difficult and oppressive for many of us. Through her scholarship, wisdom, and experiences, Dr. Davis provides us with inspiration and guidance on how to effectively and more thoughtfully resist in times of conflict, and in times where we have to remind people that our lives matter. We appreciate Dr. Davis for so much more than her vast body of scholarship. She is a living symbol of how, through the power of collective action and mobilization, we can accomplish great things, including our very freedom. Through her work and leadership, she shows us that our struggles, just like our identities, are multifaceted and intersectional. She brought this perspective with her in her work in the Black Panther Party, Communist Party, Civil Rights Movement, Women's Movement, LGBT movement, Justice for Palestine, prison abolition, and in other struggles for social justice. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Dr. Davis's many influential books, essays, and speeches, because most of you already know quite a bit about her work, which is why you're here. But I do want to mention that Dr. Davis has held professorships in some of the most prestigious universities in the nation, and her work in women's, gender, and sexuality studies, Black studies, American studies, and philosophy has influenced so many of us in the academy. Dr. Davis's work on intersectional feminism, Black feminism, and queer of color analysis has been particularly influential in my own work and scholarship. However, we did not invite Dr. Davis here just because of her scholarship, but because Dr. Davis provides us with an example of how, through critical thought and leadership, we can be the difference. Dr. Davis's voice and her impact are global, and her legacy has been monumental. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for all you've done and continue to do for us, and for honoring us with your presence tonight. And now I introduce Dr. Angela Yvonne Davis.
Good evening. Thank you. It is really wonderful to be here in the city of Milwaukee and on the campus of Marquette University. First of all, let me thank all of those who spoke before me, the provost, the president, Lauren, Brianna, and Dr. Angelique Harris, who introduced me. And I'd also like to thank Professor Jody Malamet for, she's the person who first contacted me about the possibility of a visit to Marquette. And I understand that this event is associated with the Freedom Dreams Forum that has brought together the Milwaukee community and the Marquette community to discuss key social issues of our time. Before I say anything, let me say that we should not fail to collectively recognize that we are convening this evening on colonized land. And that this should serve as an occasion for us to acknowledge the continued quest for sovereignty and justice undertaken by indigenous people in this state and in the country and throughout the Americas. There is, it seems to me, no better city in which to evoke freedom dreams. And by the way, I really love the use of the title of Robin Kelly's book, Freedom Dreams. There's no better city than this city, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where 1 out of 8 Black men currently resides inside a jail or prison. And I mention this because it has been argued that freedom, the concept of freedom that we know in Western countries, more than likely emanated from the desires of slaves to be free. And of course, Milwaukee is the city of the zip code, what is it, 53206? 53206, one of the most incarcerated zip codes in the country. And I understand that you also have a very high rate of eviction in Milwaukee as well, and that it is said that Black men get locked up and Black women get locked out. So, some people say that this is Sheriff David Clark's city. But I say this is Dontre Hamilton's city. And we thank his family for giving leadership to the movement for Black lives and for refusing to allow his life and his death to be forgotten. This is a city where racisms, inequalities, injustices loom large. But it is also a city where people refuse to believe that the struggle for freedom will suffer ultimate defeat. And therefore, we thank the immigrant rights movement here in Milwaukee for showing the country how it is one stands up to the Trump's administration's racist call for a border wall and how to resist the Islamophobic travel ban. As a person who has been involved for many years, many decades, in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I'm happy to visit a city with a sizable Palestinian population. People who live under occupation in Palestine have shown the world that despite what might appear to be insurmountable odds, they will never stop fighting for justice. And I was happy to learn about the vibrant Jewish Voice for Peace chapter here in Milwaukee. JVP stands up against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism alike. It is not afraid to engage in public criticism of the US government or of the Israeli government. And let me say that the longevity of the struggle in Palestine reminds us that our contributions to ongoing quests for freedom do not always produce immediate results. But they do keep alive the light of freedom, and they spur others to continue the work. And this is precisely the kind of encouragement we need during this particular moment of our history. And I'll talk a little bit about the political moment. And I want us to think of it as a moment. As a moment. And to imagine what it will be like 10, 20 years from now to look back on this brief moment. But I also want to speak a bit about some of the issues students, faculty, staff have been discussing on this campus. And I know that you've had your share of controversies. And I feel compelled to speak to one. And that is the whitewashed mural of Assata Shakur. And I feel compelled to speak to this issue not only because the mural depicted a friend and comrade whom I have known and supported since she was first arrested, but because such a discussion can shed light on the surreptitious work of ideology more generally. I find it very interesting that that one radical Black woman associated with the struggles of the late 60s and 70s was literally erased, and another was invited to speak. And of course, there is a very interesting similarity in the legal cases that led us both to acquire a measure of notoriety. But especially because I've seen how our images are often interchanged on the internet. And if you Google Assata Shakur, you will see pictures of me. And this fungibility of the images and the underlying politics of representation makes me experience a particular urgency in speaking to this issue, and especially because Assata is unable to speak for herself because she is in exile. So I will venture a few words, and I hope you don't mind. When I first heard about the erasure of the mural, it occurred to me that it could have very well been a reaction to a mural depicting me. I thought about the way I was portrayed, particularly during the early period, the hate mail I received after I was fired from my position at UCLA, the violent racism and anti-communism that persuaded vast numbers of people that I had no right to inhabit this country, at least not in the free world. The assumptions of my guilt when I was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted criminal list. That is a part of my history. When I was captured, when I was held behind bars. But I also remembered a situation in New Jersey, which I briefly wrote about in my foreword to Assata's autobiography. And let me just briefly tell you this story. I was involved in efforts, this was shortly after I myself was released and my trial led to an acquittal. I became involved in the cases of many other political prisoners, including the effort to raise funds for the legal defense of Assata Shakur. Assata's lawyer at the time, who continues to be her attorney, Lennox Hines, who was a professor at Rutgers University. As a matter of fact, he just retired this past fall. He hosted an event to raise funds for her a legal defense, which was a very successful event, very well attended. And since he lived in New Jersey, he invited many of us over to his home afterwards for a kind of an after party. And so we began the rather brief journey to his house when the car I was riding in was pulled over by police. And in what seemed like an eternity, certain people were asked to get out of the car. I was asked to remain in the car. Lennox, the attorney, noticed, he was driving in front of us, noticed that we had been pulled over. So immediately he doubled back and got out of the car and began to approach the scene with his bar card as evidence of the fact that he was an attorney. And as he approached us, one of the police pulled out a riot gun, and it became so clear at that moment that if any of us had made any inexplicable movement, that people would be dead. And then the story goes on. They kept us for a long time, pretending that there was a warrant out for my arrest. Of course, there was no warrant. But eventually, they allowed us to move on. We went to Lennox's house, and within about half an hour, the entire house was surrounded by police. And in the house were like the first Black woman judge in the state of New Jersey. I mean, people like that. So what did we do? We called John Conyers in Washington and told him that we needed a federal escort across the George Washington Bridge. But I recount this story because something very similar happened to Assata Shakur. And the point that I'm trying to make is that the ideologically produced response to her, who in some circles is automatically referred to as a cop killer, prevents us from understanding the way in which her image has been used to criminalize radical anti-racist struggles today. And I think that criminalization was initially designed to deter Black women from involvement in the movement. But that was not going to happen. Because there would be no Black liberation movement were it not for Black women. It is just that we are now finally witnessing the emergence of Black women's leadership, queer Black women's leadership in the movement for Black lives. But let me return to my Assata remarks. People rarely attempt to investigate the 1973 charges against Assata. And most have no familiarity at all with the evidence that was produced at the trial. If they were, they would have to acknowledge that it was proven that she herself was shot with her arms in the air. And the arm that she would have used to wield a weapon was paralyzed. So she was not only incapable of wielding a weapon, but the tests that were done after she was taken to the hospital demonstrated that there was no gunfire residue on her hands. And let me say that I'm really very, very sorry that Trooper Werner Foster was killed that evening. But to conduct an almost half-century-long campaign of retribution against a woman who could not have possibly shot him in the first place, that will not bring him back. And it is absurd. So many people take for granted that she is a cop killer. And as a result of the demonization and criminalization that has occurred, she has been in exile for many decades and was not even able to return to attend her mother's funeral. She was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted terrorist list. And I mean, I know kind of how that feels because I was on the 10 most wanted criminal list, and people like Richard Nixon, some of you may remember him, repeatedly referred to me as a terrorist. But you know, when I think about the fact that someone like Dylan Roof he has never been branded a terrorist. Those who planted the bombs at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in 1963 have never been branded terrorists. While I am not generally subjected to the kind of defamation and slander that greets Assata whenever the Fraternal Order of Police have power, wherever organized representatives of law enforcement can be found. And I think it's sad and it's not all police who have this attitude, but I think it's sad that this is the official position of these organizations. But I do still occasionally encounter such hate. But what I wanted to say this evening is that the difference between Assata's story and my own had to do with the emergence of a global movement for my freedom at a pivotal moment in my history. That is to say that people all over this country, including right here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, organized a campaign, Free Angela campaign, that reverberated all over the world. And as it turned out, even though many people were convinced that even though I might be innocent, it was not going to be possible to stand up to Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and J. Edgar Hoover, that we were facing some of the most powerful men in the world. But that movement proved them wrong. That movement proved more powerful than the most powerful men in the world. And as a result of that, I've been able to continue my work, my writing, my speaking, my organizing, and in general, creating a presence that counters the vestiges of that era. And if not for that movement, people would probably be whitewashing murals of me all the time. Movements make a difference, even if they do not necessarily achieve the goals that they posit. They make a major difference in the world. The election last November, seems like it was a long time ago, doesn't it, of Donald Trump. And I always say that, later during the inauguration, my grandniece wanted to know, she kept asking all of us, why was Donald Duck elected president? She was so puzzled, she couldn't believe it. But of course, the election of Donald Trump has created a much more challenging political context for the work that we do. On the one hand, we know that the election of Trump was in part a reaction to the important achievements associated with radical activism over the last period. Activism against racist police violence, against the prison industrial complex, and state violence more generally, against homophobia and transphobia, against misogyny and intimate violence and its linkage with state violence, against ableism, against climate change, for environmental justice, including justice for animals. Movements in solidarity with struggles that are unfolding in other parts of the world, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Palestine. And with respect to Palestine, that work has brought the question of ending the occupation and the strategy of boycott, divestment, and sanction onto the agendas of many social justice movements across the country and around the world. So this means that our work today consists both in resisting the efforts to turn the clock back and at the same time pushing forward despite the greater obstacles. We do not have to assume that our struggles will come to a standstill because of the backwardness and intransigence of the present administration. But of course, the election of Donald Trump has reverberated all over the world. It has alerted the right wing everywhere. In France, in the UK, throughout Europe, in Israel, the passage of a new law that bars proponents of BDS from traveling to Israel is clearly related to Trump's retrograde position in support of not only of the state of Israel, but his specific, his appointment of someone like David Friedman as the ambassador to Israel, who has connections with the development of settlements in Israel. And of course, the Obama administration was absolutely opposed to the continuation and extension of settlements. Let's recall that the U.S. may be a settler nation, settler colonial nation, and we can never forget that the history of this country is grounded in settler colonialism and slavery. But the state of Israel is the only settler colonial nation that is attempting to continue to expand. No other country, not Australia. I mean, we can go on and on. But we cannot allow the rising repression to prevent us from apprehending rising resistance. You know, I've been speaking about the Palestinian struggle and the state of Israel because I think it's very important to engage in public critiques of the state. Whether we're talking about the state of Israel or we're talking about the United States of America. For the very same reasons that we think it might be important to criticize the government and the state here in the United States, we should also be willing to support those who stand up against the state of Israel. And let me just say that people who demonstrate against the U.S., whether they're in Africa or the Middle East, whether they're in Asia or Latin America or Australia, have every right to engage in public criticism. And you may know that on the day of the Women's March, the day after the inauguration of Donald Trump, there were hundreds of protest marches literally all over the world. This is what democracy is all about. And I can say that for centuries, Black people inside the U.S. have been encouraged by criticism that has come from beyond the borders. I recently returned from a trip to Northern Ireland about 3 weeks ago, where it was International Women's Day, so that would have been perhaps about 3 weeks ago. And I was very impressed that people were still talking about Frederick Douglass's 1845 visit to Belfast. And there was evidence everywhere. There were murals. Those murals hadn't been whitewashed, apparently, but there were murals of Frederick Douglass. And of course, Irish solidarity in the struggle against slavery represented the willingness of people there to stand up against the institution of slavery. Black Lives Matter. This is the era of Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter, this slogan has become a universal call. As a matter of fact, when I was in Belfast, I met with the Black Lives Matter chapter in Belfast. And then a couple of days later in London. And many people have assumed that the call, Black Lives Matter, was too particular and too specific. I mean, all of you have probably been involved in conversations where people say, Now, why do you say Black Lives Matter? You should say all lives matter, right? And of course, that's what they've always said that. And as a matter of fact, the universal notion of all lives matter has actually been clandestinely racialized and gendered and classed so that that all only refers to a few. But we know that the more robust universal is to say that Black lives matter, because when Black lives are made to matter, that will mean that all lives matter. No question about it. You know, speaking about challenging the state and recognizing that one is referring to the state and not to the entire population, I can remember that an important aspect of the political education we engaged in many, many years ago consisted in learning how to distinguish between structures and people, between institutions and individuals. Even when de jure racism was the legal context for the entire South, I can remember, I grew up in the South under segregation. And I can remember that my mother taught me not to assume that every person, by virtue of the fact that they were white, were racist, that every person was racist. People all over the world had to learn how to distinguish between the United States as an imperialist force in the world and the people of this country. And there was a time when progressive people throughout the world used to refer to the other America. They were talking about the America that was not represented by the government. The point that I'm making is that if we criticize, say, the state of Israel, we do not conflate the government and its ethnic cleansing policies and its strategies of demographic engineering with all of the people who live in Israel, and certainly not with all Israeli Jews. And I make this point because we should not fear those strategies of hurling accusations of anti-Semitism at anyone who disagrees with Israel. Rather we should point out the affinity of racism and anti-Semitism, and that in standing up against the racism of the United States of America, the racism of the state of Israel, we are also passionately saying no to anti-Semitism as well. Periodically, throughout our history, there have been compelling global issues that have demanded the attention of people in the U.S. And of course, it should have happened far more frequently than it has. But the ideological work done by American exceptionalism has persuaded too many people in this country that our vision should be directed inward as opposed to outward. But every pivotal moment in our recent history has borne a clear relationship to global events. I'm thinking about the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s, the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s and 90s, the effort to stave off Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism of the aughts and the tens associated with the so-called global war against terror. In 2014, when the Ferguson protests occurred, and this was not very long after the murder of Dontre Hamilton here in this city. When Black Lives Matter was crafted into a network, it was with the assistance of Palestinian solidarity. And as a consequence, we learned very important lessons. Those of us involved in the movement against state violence learned fundamental political lessons about the police. Prior to that, we had often only demanded the accountability of the individual. That is to say, we had demanded that the individual police officer be brought to justice. Many of you remember. I mean, that happened over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. But what was different about the Ferguson protests was that we learned about the global connections of the police. As a matter of fact, I like to remember that it was when Palestinian on-the-ground activists in occupied Palestine noticed in the images that there were tear gas canisters that had the initial CTS on them. And CTS is a US company, Combined Tactical Systems. And they said, these are the same tear gas canisters that we find on the ground in Palestine. So the Israeli army gets its tear gas from the US. And then we learned that the US police forces get their training in anti-terrorism from the Israeli army. And I know Sheriff David Clark took a trip to Israel. But you see how easily racism becomes articulated with, merged with these so-called anti-terrorist strategies. And it makes sense that someone like Assata Shakur would be placed on the 10 most wanted terrorist lists, because there is this effort to link anti-racist activity with terrorism. And so as a result, I think we've learned how to develop more complicated analysis, more, to use a feminist term, more intersectional approaches in our struggle against racism. Why is it that for so long we appeared not to be moving anywhere? Because the assumption was that racism was a problem of the individual. And so, okay, so if someone said something racist, it meant that they had to go to a workshop and unlearn racism or something. You remember that. And we were using this obsolete vocabulary and could not recognize the structural character of racism. The most dramatic example of which is the state of the jails and prisons in the United States of America, in this prison nation. Now, to pursue the theme of asking questions about how the Palestinian struggle has provided practical lessons regarding the interconnectedness of our social justice struggle. I mean, if I wanted to talk about how Palestine solidarity helps to nourish and further feminist approaches to social justice, I could talk about a lot of issues. I could talk about Palestinian women's contribution to the struggle. I could talk about Razmia O'Day and the fact that, and the sexual abuse she suffered, as a result of being arrested, and the fact that she is currently facing deportation. But, I think what I want to do in the time that I have left is to point out how we can learn how to develop critical approaches to what seems to be the most normal unfolding of events. And I want to talk a little bit about feminism, right? Feminism. Yeah, let's say the word feminism. Because I was very disturbed by the representation of feminism that came from the other candidate in our election, our last election. I was disturbed by Hillary Clinton's constant evocation of a glass ceiling. And the fact that so many people assume that that's what feminism is about. It's about breaking through the glass ceiling. But if all you're trying to do is break through the glass ceiling, it means that you're already at the very top of the hierarchy and everybody else is below you. And I like to point out that the metaphors we use really matter, and we should reflect on them and think critically about them. I do not at all assent to glass ceiling feminism or lean in feminism. And I like the metaphor that was used by Michael Bennett, the NFL player, the Seattle Hawks. You know Michael Bennett, right? You know what I'm talking about. And he released a really wonderful statement on the occasion of International Women's Day. And he pointed out that he wasn't concerned about those who were trying to break through the glass ceiling, but rather he was much more concerned about those women under whom the floor was threatening to collapse. And that was the feminism that he embraced. Yeah, we could go on and on this evening, but I think I should make my way toward a conclusion. Okay, maybe one other. Okay. And let's talk about Milwaukee. And one of the things that is good about Milwaukee is that it is represented as a LGBTQ-friendly city. But the issue is a lot more complicated. And again, I want to go back to the lessons we learned by looking at the Palestinian struggle. because Israel also says that it is a haven in that part of the world for LGBTQ communities. And it likes to represent itself as the paragon of democracy in the region because of that. And so queer Palestinians have argued that this is a case of pinkwashing. Pinkwashing. Because Israel will not say that it is welcoming to queer Palestinians who call for justice for their people, even as they recognize how important it is to continue to struggle against homophobia and transphobia as they fight for justice. And I think that it's also counterproductive to assume that the way we oppose, say, transphobia is when it has become trendy to do so. You know, when we have the Caitlyn Jenners, and when we think that it is, it's really just a question of which bathroom. And we forget about the fact that trans people, and especially trans women of color who cannot easily pass, are the most consistent targets of violence, both individual violence and institutional violence. And so, you know, what we have learned in the abolitionist movement, and I haven't yet made the point that that prisons need not to be reformed, but rather abolished. This is where we are. As a matter of fact, the whole history of the institution of the prison has been a history of reform. So there are theorists and activists who recognize long ago that the institution of the prison must be abolished. Given the fact that the prison is a gendered institution and that its gender structure is a binary structure reflecting the ideology of gender in the larger society, we know now that the abolition of the prison must also entail the abolition of gender policing. If I were to venture a general critique of the prison reform movement, which spans the decades from the early 1800s to the present, from John Howard and Charles Dickens, who was a critic of the prison, I would say that all of the many reformers, as passionate as they have been and as they are about eliminating cruel and inhumane punishment, they fail to recognize that punishment cannot be transformed if the social context, the larger society, is not also radically transformed. And it's interesting because if one looks at Palestine, this is self-evident. It is impossible to address the problem of imprisonment without looking at the larger society. Talking about mass incarceration, there are currently some 7,000 Palestinian prisoners, but more than 800,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza have been imprisoned over the years. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting that there's similar statistics to Milwaukee. 40% of the Palestinian men in the West Bank have gone to jail at one time or another. So I was referring to the U.S. as a prison nation, And Palestine under Israeli occupation is certainly the worst possible example of a carceral society. And by looking at that carcerality, we have learned not to trust reform strategies that call for ankle bracelets and house arrest and the extension of other carceral strategies into the larger society, because that will mean that we will be in the process of producing the kind of open-air prison of which Palestine is the best example. And so we have much to do over the next period. And I would like us to reflect on what I might call the generationality of our struggles. Struggles for social justice are not about moments, are not about historical moments. They're about continua. Struggles always exist on a continuum. And I like to think that we here this evening, we are the materialization of the dreams of those who came before us. We are the materialization of the dreams of those who dreamt while still in chains of such a time and such a place as this. We are the manifestation of their freedom dreams. And so let us also think about those who down the line, decades, centuries from now, will be the manifestation of our freedom dreams. I want to end with a story that has remained with me since I attended in 1985 the United Nations NGO International Women's Conference in Nairobi, Kenya. And this was a time when the feminist movement, the women of color, radical women of color feminist movement, black feminist movement was emerging and becoming very influential. But I remember a woman from Kenya who continued to argue that water is a feminist issue. And, you know, there were those who were thinking, feminism is a lot more complex than that, and it has to do with, you know, the recognition of the intersectional relation and so forth and so on. And she said, water is a feminist issue. And I thought about this when I saw Palestinian water tanks punctured by Israeli bullets during my own visit to the West Bank. And I thought, water is a feminist issue. When I visited Flint, Michigan, shortly after we learned about the lead poisoning of the children through the water supply, I once again thought about the woman in Nairobi who insisted that water is a feminist issue. And when I learned about the struggles of the Standing Rock Sioux to prevent the Dakota pipeline from destroying their sacred lands and from poisoning their water, I thought, yes, absolutely, water is a feminist issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a very inspiring and challenging talk. I don't know how many lectures I've been to where the speaker has been held for an encore, so really appreciate everything that you brought to us tonight, Dr. Davis. We have time for a few questions, and where's our roving microphone person? Where are you? I know there we are, okay. So our first question is coming from Reggie Jackson, who's the head griot of the Black Holocaust Museum.
I'm going to answer questions first.
We're going to do the Q&A and then, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Reggie?
Dr. Davis, your activism is stretched over numerous decades, 4 Democratic presidential administrations, 6 Republican administrations, and a variety of social movements. Throughout this, you've managed to maintain your strong voice. In light of the current state of affairs in the country, how do you see the efforts for social justice? In an optimistic light or a pessimistic light?
Can I just use this? Okay. You know, whenever I'm asked questions like that, I defer to the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who said that one can combine a pessimism of the intellect with an optimism of the will. And I say this because we have no other choice. We have to believe in the future. And in order to believe in the future, we have to believe that the work that we do will make a difference. And I was attempting to suggest that we have to be somewhat more reflective about the consequences of the work that we do and recognize that we may not see the change immediately. As a matter of fact, the only reason we assume we will see the change immediately is because we have been primed to do so by the way we live in this capitalist society. And I am convinced that our work will make a difference. I know that even though those of us who were involved in the struggle in the 60s and 70s, and we were convinced that the revolution was coming tomorrow. And not just anti-racism, but we were convinced that we were going to overthrow capitalism. Now, we haven't yet overthrown capitalism. That's your job. You know, those of you who are young. But in the process, the work that we did made a major difference. It helped to create the conditions that allow us to imagine a different world in the future today. And so, yeah, we just have to continue. Freedom is a constant struggle. You know, that's the title of my book, and I had no idea that it was going to resonate even more in the aftermath of the election. But freedom is a continual struggle. I don't think we will ever, I'm speaking about the human population on the planet, we will ever reach a moment when they will be able to say that they won. There will always be something. And what is so exciting and so wonderful about being directly involved in struggles for social justice is that we become aware of the way in which, in the process of struggling for one thing, we discover new ideas and new struggles, and we realize how much more complicated this fight for freedom is. And that's beautiful.
Our next question is coming from Marsha Williams, Adjunct Assistant Professor of Sociology at Marquette.
Hello, Dr. Davis. Thank you for coming here today. During a recent talk at Brown University, you praised the Women's March in Washington as an act of mass mobility for change. You also critiqued the march for its adherence to the same racial hierarchy that has plagued the feminist movement since its inception. Developing a women's movement that is diverse and inclusive has long been a stated goal of its participants. And I know you've talked a lot tonight about how the struggle is a continuum, or change happens on a continuum, and I also believe that social change is as much about the process as the outcome. But this has been going on for a long time, and and I'm just wondering if you have any ideas about what kind of concrete steps we can take to evolve the women's movement as a diverse and inclusive movement, to make it evolve from an idea to an actual realization, because it seems as though it's still a huge problem that women of color's voices are pushed to the margins. So.
Okay. How many of you attended the Women's March? Okay. Well, it was an incredible experience. And I say this recognizing that there was an attempt to acknowledge the importance of leadership by women of color. And as you know, the leadership of the march consisted of a black woman, a Latina woman, a Muslim woman, and a white woman, right? And that kind of representation doesn't necessarily mean what we want it to mean. But I think in that case, it was a good thing that at least the issue was acknowledged. And I think that the feminism of our time is a feminism that was produced out of struggle, and a feminism that reflects an awareness that anti-racism has to be at the center of feminist struggles. And what is happening in the women's movement is indicative of what's happening in the larger society. There's work that we should have done in the immediate aftermath of slavery. Du Bois talked about the importance of building institutions in order to incorporate new institutions to incorporate former slaves, which meant that the democracy could not remain the same. And the problem is everything has remained the same. And we've assumed that it's only about inclusion, it's only about diversity, it's only about bringing marginalized populations into structures that are responsible for the marginalization, but allowing the structures to remain the same. So you bring black people and Latinx people into a racist institution, but the institution remains racist. You bring women within a misogynist institution, or LGBTQ people into homophobic institutions without changing them. That strategy of assimilation does not work. It does not work. This is why those of us who are abolitionists, this is the meaning of the term abolition. And the feminism, we talk about abolition feminism. Abolition feminism, which is, I think, the feminism that will lead us into the future. It's the anti-racist feminism. It's a feminism that recognizes the importance of the working class. It's a feminism that is intersectional. And if we are to go anywhere in the future, we will be led by something like abolition feminism. Thank you.
Our next question is from Venus Williams, who's the executive director of Alice's Garden.
Excuse me, I need to come through. Excuse me, coming through. Excuse me, right here. Coming through. So, Dr. Davis, before I can even ask you my question, I have a gift for you. It is a gift representing all of us who understand that a movement needs to be fed. So for all of us who grow food, cultivate food, and cook food, but in particular, this food item represents Truman McGee and Funky Fresh spring rolls. They are vegan, sweet potato, and black bean spring rolls, and probably at least 2/3 of the folks in this room have been fed by Truman, who is in the house. But my question for you comes out of my own personal understanding of my connection to my ancestors. So on my personal life journey, I awaken each morning with the understanding that the unfinished business of the ancestors is the blueprint for my life. Do you have personal or historical ancestors whose voices, wisdom, mandates for justice and equity form your path and your purpose here in creation?
Well, first of all, thank you for the vegan spring rolls. Funky Fresh. And we should, when we're talking about social justice movements, we should also talk about the food sovereignty movement. And we should, also recognize how important it is to eat consciously. I'm not saying everybody needs to become a vegan, although that would be great. I would definitely, but be conscious of the conditions of production of what it is you put in your body. Because you may be poisoning yourself instead of nourishing yourself without even realizing it. Capitalist food production is only for the production of profit. It has nothing to do with providing the nourishment that we need to grow our bodies and our spirits. And I think you said so much more eloquently than I did the point that I was trying to make about us today experiencing the freedom dreams of those who came before us. And it's important that we recognize our own work as capable of producing the freedom dreams that will be inhabited by those who come after us. I think that spiritual connections are so important, and particularly to counter the ways in which we are compelled to imagine ourselves as isolated individuals. This is what neoliberal ideology asks us to do, to think of ourselves as individuals, and the meaning of our lives has to be forged within the context of the lifetime of one individual. And that doesn't work. That no matter how hard you try to create a life, you will never create a life unless it is connected to the lives of others, past, present, and future. And just as Just as our ancestors are spiritually present with us as we venture further along the path to freedom, we will be spiritually present long after we are gone in the communities of those who continue in the future. So thank you so much for raising that question.
Our next question comes from Marshall Friedman, who is a student in the College of Arts and Sciences.
Before I ask my question, I would just like to say thank you from my mother. It's been so much that you represent to the Black women of urban cities and urban America, and that's coming straight from her. She would like to say thank you. And you have so much knowledge. I just have so many questions, but the one question I have right now is, considering everything going on in the world, in our community, and all around us, everything we see, where do you think we should start rebuilding our community? Where does it start to you?
You know, there's not one answer to that question. It starts where we are. And there is no formula, but I believe that everybody who cares can make a difference. Everybody who cares can make a difference. And you can make a difference in a way that is fulfilling to you. And, you know, many people have asked me, well, you know, aren't you, you've been involved for so long, for decades and decades and decades, and the same problems are still here. Don't you feel that all of your sacrifices have been in vain? And so I have to first say, well, first of all, I don't feel as if I've sacrificed anything, because I think I have lived the best possible life I could have ever wanted to live. And even those moments of my life that have been difficult, you know, I faced capital punishment 3 times. And everybody was convinced that I was going to the gas chamber. But I learned a great deal. I learned that if people come together, we can win victories that we could never imagine winning alone. And, you know, I've come to recognize that the time I spent in jail was a real gift. You know, at the time it was difficult, but it has helped me craft my entire life. I don't know who I would be had I not had the experience of spending that time in jail. And I am thankful for it. I'm very thankful for it.
Thank you.
And so what I say is that, you know, do the work that needs to be done in the way that feels most fulfilling to you, in a way that reflects your passions. Don't try to do somebody else's job. Do your own. And when we all come together, we'll make a difference.
Our last question is from Latrice Harris Collins, who's Assistant Dean of Admissions here at Marquette. Latrice?
Dr. Davis, first I want to say thank you on behalf of this Marquette community. I come here double-fisted with my daughter, who will soon be, come on. My daughter, Nyara Collins, will be joining this freshman class this fall, and I'm so proud. Doing undergraduate admissions for almost 14 years, I look around this room and I see my work everywhere in this room, and I'm so proud. I see my work walking around, and I see y'all in here, and I'm so happy. And so my question isn't about the past, it's about our future, which my daughter is a part of. She's majoring in communications, journalism, digital media, that's where we're going. In a world of alternative facts, in a world where we can't trust what we hear all the time, she is jumping into a field because she understands the value of truth in the spoken and written word. And I ask you, you've blessed us all tonight, and I certainly feel fed. I feel fed in so many ways, and I know you have changed not only me, but so many of my students. Boy, you have changed so many people in this room tonight with your word. But I ask you if you have any words of wisdom to offer the future class, which my daughter is a part of, that will be joining Marquette University's family in the fall, especially as her being a woman, majoring in journalism. Do you have any words of wisdom to help them as they make the transition in their collegiate path? What words do you have to inspire them in this world that we see that, hey, when we're so uneasy?
Well, our hope resides in young people. You know, young people are the future. And so, you know, what is your daughter's name?
Nyara Akila Collins.
Nyara Akila Collins. You represent the future. And I don't know whether I should tell young people what it is they should be doing. I know I shouldn't be doing that, because they are the ones who will show us the way. So my words of wisdom, you know, sometimes wisdom is not that great of a thing, you know, because oftentimes older people think they are so wise that they know everything, and they refuse to recognize that their wisdom and their knowledge is not only being transferred to the younger generation, but the younger generation is in a position to learn so much more than what we know. And, you know, we talked about metaphors earlier on, and I said metaphors matter, and I like the metaphors of each generation standing on the shoulders of the previous generation. And that not only means that they absorb our experiences and our knowledge and our ways of understanding the world, but it also means that they get to see a bit further because they're on our shoulders. Therefore, we who are the elders should learn how to follow the youth and their passion, because you are leading us to the future. Thank you very much.
It's always